Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Inside the Admissions Office. I'm super excited for today's episode because I've got two former admissions officers here to help us break down what makes a killer activities list and personal essay. And we're not just talking theory. This time, we're using a real Common App profile from one of our very own InGenius prep students. This student actually applied to Duke University, so if Duke is on your list, you're in for a real treat. Today, we'll give you a behind-the-scenes look at how admissions officers actually evaluate those key pieces of your application. So without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So we have a very fun episode planned today. So as many of our listeners know, finding the right college fit can be a huge challenge for students. And today we've got a great opportunity to discuss how to match a student's strengths, interests, background with the best college options out there. So today the goal of the episode is to really uncover exactly how admissions officers assess applications. So today I'm joined by two amazing guests who have years of experience reviewing and evaluating college applications. So they've seen it all and they know what works and don't work. So it's going to be a very fun episode. But today we've got something extra special in store. At the end of the episode, we're going to challenge our guests with a live kind of rapid fire exercise walking through InGenius Prep student Common App profiles from a previous cycle. We'll get into them when we're ready to dive in. But let's kick things off with something a little bit fun. Of course, would love to get you guys to introduce yourself really quickly so our listeners can get to know you a bit better. And then I've also added a second layer to this. If your time as a former admissions officer were to be made into a movie, what would that title be? And what's the story behind it?
Thanks, Julian. Hey, everyone. My name is Zach Harris. I'm the Associate Director of Council Enrollment Communications here at InGenius Prep, and super happy to be with you today during the holiday season. I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't know if I have a name, but I am big into law and order, like procedural drama sort of type things. And while not as serious in terms of what we're doing here in admissions, I think anything related to having a jury involved and navigating the process and the logistics behind the entire application is like what committee felt like to me. Nick, not necessarily an apples to apples comparison here, but I think ultimately the idea of sort of someone having to plead their case and having a team of people surrounding a table and then having to decide who gets in and who doesn't really felt like our job for a really long time. I think the second sort of idea I came up with was anything just related to an investigation. So my wife and I really enjoy watching Columbo or like the new Matlock that just came out not that long ago. And that's what I was doing. I was like navigating an entire application as like a PI or like an investigator. And I'm really trying to figure out who was the best fit for the institutions that I was working for. Fun, exciting, and you just never know what's going to come around to the next corner.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Zach. Something about a courtroom drama, legal drama. Not like A Few Good Men where they're yelling at each other in the courtroom, but like you definitely would leave the committee room with some days with like strong disagreements with people. Mm-hmm. Always civil. But anyway, my name is Nick Stroll. Nice to be with you, everyone. I'm a former admissions officer at InGenius Prep, and I also used to be an admissions officer at Yale University. And in terms of thinking about movies, there was a movie that came out about 10 years ago called Admission, which I'd never seen it actually. I didn't get great reviews, but I remember joking with many of my colleagues about that. I think it's a romantic comedy with Tina Fey and Paul Rudd, where Tina Fey is maybe a Princeton admissions officer, something like that, falling in love with kind of rapscallion college counselor at some alternative high school. So that's one you can check out if you want to get perhaps not a perfectly accurate, but some sense of what people think admission is. I will put in a small plug if any of you are interested in getting a sense of kind of the zaniness sometimes of the admissions office. That when I was at Yale, I had a number of colleagues in the admissions office who were very artistic and creative. Many were Yale alums, so they came from that undergraduate scene. And they produced a over-the-top recruitment video called That's Why I Chose Yale, which was this musical, which you can find on YouTube. It's probably 15 or 20 minutes long. It's totally ridiculous. But it gives you a sense of maybe some of the admissions officers that were working in the Yale office at that time, and I think still are. Just a little bit of silliness and fun that can get to you during the admissions season when you're reading a lot of applications. So that's the product, I think, of that particular video. If you want to look it up on YouTube, it's not a movie, but it gives you a sense of maybe what is going through the minds of admissions officers as they're dreaming up new ways to talk about why you should choose Yale, for example, or any other school.
What's so funny about that, sorry to bogart the podcast, Julian, but my team and I was working at Bowdoin at the time, and we took a field trip, and we actually went to go see that movie in one of the local theaters, and it was ridiculous. It was based on a true story, like one of those things. It was probably like 15% accurate, like it was totally ridiculous. But this process is so complex, and certainly they would never get all of the nuances, but a good plug.
Yeah, I haven't watched that movie before, so I must watch it tonight. But yeah, let's get into the questions today. So the first one is, what's the first thing that admissions officers look at when they read a Common App? Is there like a make or break section?
I can jump into this one first, Nick. I think the first part, and I think this is really important, is when we're giving presentations and talking to families about the idea of context really matters a lot. I think in a lot of cases, I'm sure, Nick, this happened to you a lot, would be at college fairs or talking to high schools, and someone would say, oh, like I have this GPA and this resume, am I going to get in, or what are my chances, or whatever. And we always understood why the question came up, but ultimately there's so much context that we have to understand first about a high school. What curricula, or do they have AP, IB, none of the above? Where is the school located, urban, rural? What resources, opportunities does a school have? The first thing that I would do is, before I would even jump into a file, is I would learn about the school. This is something that the school counselor would give to us either through their sort of recommendation sort of section or via school profile. And even if I knew a school reasonably well, I would still read it, and I would still make sure I understood what am I really getting into. So that really served as the lens. So when I was reading the 5, 10, 50 applications from that one high school, I just understood what is the baseline. So when I would read a file, it would help me understand, relative to their own experiences, how are they doing, not only academically, but just in terms of their overall impressiveness. I can't answer that question until I understand the context and where they're coming from. So the school profile, really understanding the school, is always like step one. And then for me, in every place that I've worked at, so I worked at Bowdoin, Johns Hopkins, Regis College, and George Washington University, there wasn't ever you had to read a file this exact way. I think as like a new staff member, you typically do things in relative order, but once you know what you're doing and more veteran staff, I typically tended to jump into testing and transcript first, and then work my way through the Common App and other pieces of that. And I think it just helped me understand this is an academic exercise. So being able to really help me understand where are they academically really helps frame the rest of the application after I was done looking at testing and looking at their overall transcript.
Yeah, I think a lot of similarities to what Zach said. In terms of my process at Yale, when I was at Yale, I would usually start by just reading the Common Application, the student's portion of the Common Application, because not for any particular reason. Sometimes it was just because that was the first document that came up in our process. But I did like to hear from the student first. So I would read their personal information, I would look at their activities list, and I would read their personal statement. And that might be the first document I would read before I proceeded on to even the transcript or school report or Yale supplementals. Not to jump ahead to future questions when they have, but we did really read every part of every application. And so I took notes on the student's portion of every Common Application. And I really took the personal statement to be the student's introduction of themselves. That helped me get a sense of who the student was. And at that point, I would be, after reading it, I would usually be either intrigued or perhaps a little bit uncertain. And then I would move on to other parts of the application. And soon up after that would be the transcript and counsel report, which if there was a break, I think if there was a make it or break it section, that transcript specifically, even more so than testing, could be the break it section. Certainly at Yale, but really at any school, depending on what their metrics or their expectations may be, the transcript has to meet a certain threshold in terms of expectations, in terms of course rigor and GPA. So sometimes I might get very excited by a personal statement. I'd really like what I read from the student, but their transcript simply wasn't up to par in terms of what our applicant pool was. Other times I might be disappointed by the first thing I read from a student in the personal statement. Even if the transcript was excellent, it left me searching in the rest of the application for other things that were intriguing. But I think, as we'll talk about with some other questions today, every part of the application matters. And so good applications tend to build on themselves, each part of it. So it's hard to identify, I think, specific sections which are more important than others. But certainly academics, if there is one, the academics is going to be the one.
That's interesting. Do you guys know how to figure out if a student's extracurriculars align with a specific college value or mission?
I can start on this one. I think that the first thing I would say was reading at Yale, we weren't looking for a specific profile in any way. And we weren't necessarily looking for students who even matched with what we thought of as our strength, because sometimes it would be exciting to find a student who was different from the typical student we admitted, but who nevertheless found something intriguing about Yale and seemed to be a good fit. But at the same time, I think what you look for is our themes in the students' activities. Is the student really big into service, for community service, for example? Are they big into the arts or music? Are they really into research? And that would usually be evident from the activities list. What are the most important activities? Where have they spent their time and their hours in high school? And then as you read through the application, of course, you want to hear, when you get to the school-specific supplements, you want to hear how their interests and their experiences match up to the school's resources and how they envision taking advantage of the school's resources. So that's just as important as those themes. But certainly you can get a sense right away from reading the activities list to see what kind of the main interests of a student are. But just as important is going to be how the student articulates the way that they envision themselves taking advantage of the opportunities at the particular school they're applying to. If they can't articulate that clearly, then it really doesn't matter whether we think their activities are a good fit. We want to hear from them explain why they think they're a good fit for a particular school.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, I think every school has a different personality. That's something that we tell InGenius students all of the time. And I think when you're working in a place, you just understand and you can feel it because you're talking to current students, you're being trained as an AO on the admissions process and the reading process at that school. So I think there's something just that feels intangible sometimes. Sometimes it actually is tangible, right? A school's mission statement is really maybe something that they latch onto and are looking for students who in different ways execute that mission. But I think to this point, college in so many ways in America is actually about difference. And it's about how do you bring different viewpoints together? How do you bring different perspectives together, all aligned with what that college is really looking for? I think that's why you find confusion in this process in America, is because you have schools that have similar admit rates who a student may apply to all of them and get very different decisions at each of them. So I think ultimately it's really about how do you as an individual research the schools you're applying to in a way that allows you to get to know them incredibly well, and then be able to, whether it's extracurriculars, essays, or major selection, in a really authentic way, really align you with that school and sort of the things that they might be looking for. But yeah, it's part of the fun.
A little example of that from the Yale perspective, and that's that Yale is a school that has a lot of strengths in the arts and humanities, and it attracts a lot of applicants who are excited about music and the arts and theater and humanities and social sciences especially. But Yale has a small engineering program. And when we saw students who wanted to apply to Yale to study engineering, we were quite interested. Why do you want to come to Yale to study engineering? Especially if you're a top student. You could choose MIT, you could choose Harvard, Princeton, a number of great schools. And at Yale, the engineering program was different from the engineering program you would find at MIT or Harvard. At Yale, we were looking for engineers who wanted to be a roommate with a history major, or wanted to be a roommate with a music major. Maybe they didn't want to work as an engineer in the future, but they wanted to run a company. And they wanted to know, they needed the engineering know-how to do that. But at the same time, they wanted to gain other leadership skills or other knowledge in a liberal arts setting to do that. And what that means is that if you were to apply to Yale as an engineer, if you were a top engineering student and you had not researched Yale engineering, but you had written your application as if you were applying to MIT or to Caltech, you would not have been a very appealing Yale applicant. But if you had really researched Yale engineering and really been able to articulate why Yale engineering is the particular place you want to study engineering in that liberal arts context, then you could really stand out, even though that's not considered one of Yale's strengths or even the greater number of applicants that they attract. Again, that just points to like in-depth school research can really make a difference at really competitive schools.
I know you mentioned, Nick, that in the Common App file, every section is taken very seriously, of course. But when it comes to the essay portion, do admissions officers actually read every word of the essay or just like pretty much skim through it? Because I know you guys have a time limit to how you evaluate specific files, but at what point do you give your full attention to, and what makes one essay truly stand out from the rest?
This was a common question that I would get at Yale information sessions when I was an admissions officer is, do you actually read every part of the application or the essay? And I can confidently say yes. Every admissions officer that I worked with, and myself included, we really did read every word of every application. Sometimes when you start to read an essay or start to read part of it, you might read faster if you think you're reading what you're expecting to read, like in terms of it's confusing or perhaps not well written. You might read it faster at that point, but you do read every word. But what would catch my eye, and I think what would catch any admissions officer's eye, is a good story. Like fundamentally, in the personal statement, a good story is going to be something that would make me slow down and read everything extra carefully. But a good story is also one that I think makes a good personal statement, because if we think in terms of what makes a good story in terms of a novel or a movie or TV show, those stories are usually about growth and the character's growth. And if you can write a personal statement or essay in which you and perhaps even other characters demonstrate that growth, but especially you, then that's going to be a good and compelling story. And that's going to be something that will stand out. As I read every word of every essay, a good story would be one that makes me slow down and really take notice.
Quickly, and I agree with Nick, 99.5% of the time. This is a podcast, so let's have some fun, right? I'll take a more slightly controversial take on this, which I think is the admissions officer's job is very hard. And especially at schools where you're potentially reading upwards of 1,000 to 2,000 applications, if not more, for one person in a given admissions cycle, which is really only like several months when you really think about it. I would say that I think admissions officers read every line. I don't know if it's every word all of the time. I think I've been in situations where I'm doing a great job of summarizing and be able to advocate for students. But you always will get some essays that, quite frankly, are not good. And whether it's because it's about someone else, whether because the writing is terrible, there's a whole plethora of reasons why essays are bad in this process. And if I read a bad essay, it's going to be hard for me to read every single word. But I'm going to look at every line. And I make that small distinction only because you just never know what someone may say and what a student may talk about that helps frame their application, right? So even in a bad essay that I know most likely we're going down a very specific road in this admissions process, you still want to give that respect to the student and go through. So I would say every line for me, I think feels like an ability to still catch things that you want to make sure that you're catching. But at the same time, we all know the pressures that we face as AOs in this process and how quickly we have to get through this process. So when we talk to our own InGenius students, I think to Nick's point is so spot on. It's really about the story, right? I'm sure, Nick, you've been in a situation where kids are like, this word is going to be the thing that gets me. And no, the word is not like what's going to get you in. It's going to be the story. How are we able to execute that story in a way that really is compelling and exciting to admissions officers? There are only 7 prompts you get to choose from on the Common App. Someone's going to choose your same prompt. So ultimately, it's really about the execution of that story. And we're all people. Like ultimately, navigating the committee process is really about getting us excited enough to be in a room of our peers and basically in a small way put your reputation on the line to be like, hey, I really want this kid to be admitted, and then be able to justify that amongst your peers. So having a really strong essay can really help that process along.
Yeah, I think even on Reddit, I've seen some threads of kids who have applied for colleges. They are very concerned about their essays in terms of they're concerned about whether their story is compelling enough, whether they have to write an extraordinary experience or something traumatic. I think they overthink about those aspects. And so maybe any advice for students who are stuck in terms of writing personal essays? Do they have to write something that's traumatic or anything out of the ordinary?
I think they just have to be themselves. And I know that's like the most like cliche thing that anyone can ever say, but it's honestly very true. This process isn't about perfection. It's not about admitting these extraordinary stories. Like sometimes kids are just kids. We're navigating 17-year-olds who haven't really lived a lot of life. So I think, Julia, it's so spot on that I think kids get very caught up on this is boring, or I haven't had this experience, or whatever the situation may be. And I think our work at InGenius is really about how do we then find, even if it's one specific story or one specific example of something that happened during a summer program or a family trip, or something that could just be funny, or obviously that matches a student's application persona, but it could just be one nugget of something that we pull that thread on that becomes a really interesting and a really exciting story, where oftentimes kids are like, this is boring. So I think that's part of our job, is to really get to know these kids as much as we can, so we're able to pull out something from them that they might classify as boring, or something that they wouldn't have thought about in the very beginning. But our expertise allows us to know that it's not about this big thing that has to happen. It's really about the execution of that story. One of the sort of essays I remember from my time working in admissions was a young woman who wrote about the different cars that her family had as she was growing up, each car that her family grew up with, from family trips to even just mundane tasks and errands that they would do. And it was not a very, I would say, extraordinary topic, but the execution of the writing and the engagement of the way in which she was able to execute her vision was amazing. When it was something that if you had said to me earlier on in that cycle, hey, you're going to really enjoy the story about a young woman talking about the car she grew up with, I'm not sure if I would have thought to myself, oh, that's like compelling. But in a lot of ways, it's not about the topic. It's more so about the execution sort of the topic, and the ability for the student to next point to tell a story that really engages the AO in a really exciting way.
Yeah, I would just add briefly, I agree with all of that, in that you'll see online many pieces of advice from various sources, whether it's on Reddit or other websites, about which topics are better than others, or avoid this topic or that topic. And I truly don't believe that there's any topics that are better than others or should be off limits. It really is in the execution. And specifically, I think what Zach means by that is that there's some element of reflection from the student. And it's hard to do as a high school student, and for anyone, even myself. If I were writing a personal essay, it would be a challenge for me to reflect on who I am and who I've become, and share that with a stranger. But if you can reflect on that, no matter your topic, if you can show some depth of reflection, then that's going to stand out from the large number of young people and high school students who are writing an essay, no matter the topic. So if you take it seriously, if you're really genuine, anything can work if you're opening yourself up a bit.
I think from a previous webinar that we did about standing out in applications, Natalia was saying that you don't have to be a president of a club or something just to stand out. But are there any other unique activities or talent that can guarantee that you'll stand out to admissions officers? And what counts as unique?
I really don't like that word, if I'm being super honest. I think it's hard, because I think what it ends up doing is it just makes kids like freak out. And then I think it becomes all about, how do I become unique versus how do I follow my passion, and how do I follow the things that I enjoy doing as a student. And I think Natalia obviously is spot on here. But at every place that I've ever worked, it wasn't as though we filtered on class presidents and only those kids got to be like admitted, or we filtered on every kid who was a founder of an organization, and then only those kids had a chance to be admitted. Every school needs connectors. They need glue individuals. They need sort of the sixth or seventh person off the bench. Just like kids who just are able to go into any situation and really thrive. And sometimes those are the quieter students. Sometimes they're not the most outgoing in terms of their personality. And I think that can be okay. So I think I'm always pushing back on that word because I think what it ends up doing is it has students feel like they have to be a certain way to get into college. And ultimately, that's not true. The communities that these colleges in the US are building are all about community. And in order to build a community which has different people, you have to have difference in all aspects of what that means. I think for me, standing out, yes, part of it is about activities, organizations, having clarity of mission and of what your purpose may be after college. But Nick and I have been doing this for a long time. The number of kids that we would read in the application process who would then come to our colleges and completely switch their interests or what they thought they were going to study academically, or even what they were going to jump into extracurricularly, it happens all the time. So in so many ways, our job isn't about wanting them to mirror what they're doing in high school. It's more about being open to possibility and open to exploration in a way that is intangible in a lot of ways. And I think really trying to find students who are not just like doing things just to do them, but because they actually enjoy what they're doing in the process of learning and the process of experiencing. And I think in so many ways that has nothing to do with being unique or distinct. I think it has really everything to do with just a student's desire to be themselves. And I think that authenticity matters. Nick and I can tell when kids are just doing things just to do them, when there's no passion, there's no excitement, because it comes across in their writing. You can have an amazing activities list, but if there's no passion within the writing, or I know we're going to talk about letters of recommendation next, and there's nothing from the letters of recommendation that speaks to that internal fire that we want kids to have, I could care less what the AL looks like if there's nothing else that backs up that motivation and that passion. I think in so many ways, we're trying to navigate what we see on paper, but also trying to learn about these kids as much as we can so we really understand that, again, it's not about being unique or distinct, but it's more so about how will they thrive in this environment and what qualities do they have that we know will really succeed at the places that we're working.
I would agree with that. I think that what can make a student unique is truly their mindset of how are they planning to approach college. I think at places like Yale and other top schools, we're looking for students, just like Zach said, who are going to make the community a better place. That means they're going to be interested in other people and interested to learn from other people who are different from them. It's also going to mean that they're open-minded, they're excited to explore. And that partly explains perhaps why people come into college and change majors, because they're just genuinely curious about the world and they want to learn more and they find other things that fascinate them. Just to step back for a moment, one thing that is unique about the top US colleges, speaking here of like maybe the top 20 schools and especially liberal arts schools, is all of them offer excellent academic opportunities. And it was rare when I was reading an application for Yale that it came down to questions about the students' academic strengths or what they were going to contribute academically, because they were already going to be very strong students, no matter what major they intended to choose, knowing, of course, that they might change that major. We were more interested in what kind of community member would they be. And that is going to be something that you can sometimes get a good sense of, often get a good sense of holistically from reading the students' essays and getting a sense of their perspective on things, looking more at the big picture items. What topic did they choose to write about for their personal statement? Did they choose to write about one of their best achievements, or did they choose to write about some time when they helped a friend get through a difficult situation and learn something about themselves? And then, of course, there's other pieces to the puzzle, like letters of recommendation, where other people attest to your strengths. But really, I think top schools, they're not looking necessarily for the absolute top academics, because all of those, that's taken for granted. They're looking for students who will create a community, a diverse and vibrant, interesting community in different ways. And that's something that you, as the applicant, you can't anticipate what they're looking for in terms of whether they're looking for an engineer or a musician. But what they are looking for is someone with that perspective who's going to be excited to embrace that community spirit and contribute in some genuine way, authentic way to it.
Do admissions officers actually ever disagree about whether a student is the right fit for their school? And how do you guys actually resolve it?
Yeah, this committee. There's disagreements all of the time. I think Nick used the word civil, and I would agree, but it gets heated. Absolutely. I'm sure Nick has examples. I can think of a handful where just for my own students, I really wanted someone to be admitted and thought that they should, and they weren't. And those stick with you. It's purely altruistic. Like there's no ego of, oh, I wanted them to get in. It being about me. It's really about, you feel so strongly about the applications that you're reading. And I think those of us who are really good at this job, and Nick is absolutely included in this, you're doing like an extra layer of filtering. So when you go into committee, you're already bringing everyone that you really think should be in the class. Versus, like, I'm sure I would have joked around with friends of mine in this field, because you would almost have some people that would bring like more than they probably should, as a way to like filter off some applications so you would have more get in. But yeah, Jillian, it gets heated sometimes. And again, it's always about the advocacy for the student. And I think how it gets resolved is we just understand as admissions officers that there are bigger priorities than in this process, and quite frankly, sometimes more than the student. Nick said it earlier, you never will know what those internal priorities are for a school in a given year. They will never publicize them, they will never talk about them, but every college has them, whether it's geographic, whether it's academic, whether it's extracurricular. These are things that you go into this cycle sort of understanding, okay, these are things that we may need to be focusing on. And then that means sometimes you have a student who you really want to be admitted, who may not be in sort of one of those priority areas, who doesn't get in. And you have to understand that it's part of the process. This is a very competitive situation that you're going into. And all you can do as an AO is do your best. I think from the student perspective, very quickly, what that means and how we talk about with our IGP students is that you really have to leave it all on the table. You have to put effort into this process. You have to be deliberate about the ways in which you talk about yourself and how that aligns with your application persona. And we talk this all the time. As long as you do your absolute best, that's really all that you can control. And there's a pride that our kids should have once they click submit, because once you do that, it's really out of your hands completely, and it's really up to the AO to advocate for you. But yeah, committee is fun. I always really look forward to it, but absolutely, you leave the room as peers, as friends, as colleagues, but in that space, you want your kids to be admitted and do your best to make that happen.
Committee was my favorite part of the process. It was intense, but it was where everything came together and culminated. And it was also a chance to have really interesting discussions with other people, other admissions officers, but also whoever else may be in the room, which at any given time at Yale, that usually included the dean of admissions, or if the dean wasn't there, probably the number 2 person in the office. So some very senior person would chair the committee. There would be a couple of senior admissions officers. There'd be myself, who might be presenting a geographic region. And then there would be typically a guest of some kind, usually a faculty member or a dean from somewhere at the university, who could be a bit of a wild card. One day you might have a math professor, another day you might have a theater professor, and they don't know anything about the admissions process other than they work with Yale students. So there's certain things that may catch their eye in an application, for better or worse, that might not be either important or something that an admissions officer would notice. That can make the discussions quite interesting. But that's something maybe to keep in mind for students who are writing applications, is that you don't really know who may be seeing your essay in the admissions committee. Of course, your admissions officer is going to be one who's reading it, but you could have your personal statement put on the screen, the projector, for everyone in the committee room to see. And you might have an engineering professor one day looking at it, or an English professor looking at it. And so that might be a good reminder to write for a general audience, and perhaps to try not to write for a specific audience, because that may not be the audience that is actually evaluating your application in the admissions committee. So it's a fun process, because there really are disagreements. Usually, the vast majority of the time, after we've discussed a application, we would come to a consensus. But in times where there was division, we might have 5 people in the room, we would vote. Sometimes it could be a 3-2 or 4-1 vote. Usually the dean might make the final decision if it's going to be close, or potentially we kick the can down the road. But yes, definitely disagreements. And That's also a good reminder to students as they're putting together the application to share their materials with different people, get a sense of, does this really reflect who I am? And to really just be yourself, because you can't try to guess what the admissions committee is looking for. You can't try to think this profile is going to stand out, because you just don't know. The best way to do it is to genuinely be yourself, and that will usually carry the day. If people recognize that you're being yourself, no matter where they're coming from in that admissions committee, they're going to acknowledge it and recognize it.
All right, now for the fun part, we're diving into a real Common App profile from one of our very own InGenius Prep students from a past cycle, of course. I've already shared the profile with the both of you in the interview doc, so if you're looking at it now, let's kick things off with student A. They're from the Santa Barbara area in California. I'll pass it over to the both of you now. Feel free to have an open discussion and walk us through what your thought process on their activities list and personal essay. And let's see where the conversation goes.
Awesome. Again, this is, I think, a good exercise because of how quickly we read things and how it's, for me at least, I think it's just like initial scan. I want to look at not only the title, but quickly also be paying attention to what the student's impact is. So navigating action verbs and things that they're using to describe their activity, but also paying attention to sort of the left side of the screen, which talks about like when they did certain things and how long they were doing things as well. And I think you just get good at being able to sort of do all of it at one time. So as I'm looking at this, I'm looking at, okay, like the first activity, last 2 years of high school for a third year, and immediately picking up on doing something outside of high school. So navigating being an author and a researcher, and this looks like this person partnered with a University of Michigan professor doing work in criminal reform. So for me, without knowing anything else, I'm already locked in. I think there's a million different academic interests that a student could have. Criminal reform is a very different one. I'm already really engaged just by the topic that the student has chosen to be more involved in. So now for me, it's about how does this then connect to the other activities? Is this sort of just like a one-off, or is there a thread that the student has? So then for me, as I go into the next one, I see predicting crime with AI. So now what's happening is the student is building layers. So we have research for the first one, and then we're doing more research with the second activity, but doing it in a different way by now bringing technology into the picture as well. Again, it just sort of, for me, the level, I think Nick said something about this a little bit earlier, but it's just like building sort of excitement in a way that now I'm really in this. The every word piece thing that we were talking about earlier on essay, that's where my mind is. I'm like, okay, cool. Like this is different. This feels different than other people. How can I learn more about the student based upon other things that they've been involved in?
I think one of the things I pay attention to is what activities has the student chosen to list first in their activity list. I read that as an intentional decision, even if the student hasn't thought of it that way, or maybe has or hasn't thought of it. The way that I think most admissions officers will read the activity list is that they truly ask you to list the activities that are in the order that's most significant to you. And notice that does not have to be the activities that you've done the most hours for. It wouldn't be surprising if they were, right? If you put a lot of hours into something. But you can notice in a list like this, the student has chosen, I think, very well, the first two activities really set up what Zach said, this interesting combination of computer science, artificial intelligence, and criminal justice research and activities. And so that kind of sets the stage immediately for a theme, which I'll continue to look for. Now, that's not the only thing to the activity list. As we move down, we can see that the student has some leadership roles in their school community. For instance, they're the founder of a tutoring program, a computer science tutoring program at their school. They've also done a kind of an interesting internship, it appears, in astronomy at their school. That's a unique activity. I might look elsewhere in the application to learn a little bit more about that. Perhaps that's something where if there's a short essay where you can elaborate on an activity, I might be interested to know where does that interest come from. And then I noticed towards the end of the list, just really good school involvement. The student working as a prefect, which is as at a boarding school, a monitor or an important school leadership position. They're involved in school life in various ways, including in sports. I would describe this as a very full and robust activity list. You have 10 substantial activities. What I think it does well is initially at the beginning, it establishes a theme. And then the rest of the activity list details accurately the different ways that the students involved in school and community life.
I think what I really like too, before we jump into the essay, is that you have 10 activities to choose from, or 10 activities on the Common App to talk about. And it's really hard for students, no matter how strong they are, to have even 4 or 5 of them be connected. I think ultimately it's our job at InGenius to try and make that happen with our kids as much as possible. But it's very hard to do that, just depending upon the student's interest, their time and motivation, et cetera. I think what I'm also picking up on here is that the first 5 of them really, to Nick's point, really do set the stage for a central theme. Number 1 is about the justice system, criminal reform. 2 is about AI and crime. 3 is really about doing work with the Model UN. Both in the description, it's easy to see what the kid is actually doing, debating policy reform on a weekly basis. And again, drug and policy and prison reform is connected to that idea. 4 is about a class they took at Duke about criminal law. And then 5 is about a CS program. I think for me, this is exactly what we would be doing, is navigating what are the themes, right? What am I then anticipating? For me, without knowing what's going to happen next, I'm anticipating that a large chunk of either essays I'm going to read in the future, whether it's the personal statement or the supplement, are going to be surrounding any one of these first 5 activities lists. So the expectation is building. And again, I think there's an excitement there. And as we go into their personal statement, that's exactly what they talk about, right? They're literally talking about this trip that they took to Portugal and the differences between the U.S. criminal and prison system versus what they're doing with teenagers within Europe. To me, what I really appreciate about this is that there's a connection. It's not just writing a random story about another topic unrelated, but it's building the layers. You have the activity list as a foundation, and typically you would read in this order, AL first and personal statement after. For me, it builds the continuity that I really appreciate. I think if this person had gone in a completely different direction, in my opinion, I think it would have derailed the momentum. But you're already doing something that feels different than what most teenagers are not even talking about. And then you're continuing and using the personal statements in a way that helps explain why they're doing what they're doing. And that's exactly what, to me, a strong application is able to do, is if it gives you nuggets of information which you're intrigued about. And then with the writing, it actually gives you the explanation as to why they're doing those things. And that is really, to me, just a perfect complement of what admissions officers are really looking for.
Yeah, as I read the personal statement, that's exactly what this student is doing, is you get a sense of where the student's interest in criminal justice reform comes from. As we look through the statement, we can see that the student's telling a story about meeting another young person with the same name, which is a great vehicle for a story, as we talked about, putting together a good story. But what I like about this essay is it helps to unfold or unwrap that interest in criminal justice reform that we see in the activity list with a good story that involves genuine reflection. In this case, the student meeting someone else with the same name, about the same age, who's had a very different life. And it leads the applicant to reflect in their personal statement on how their life has been different from this particular young person's life, which is exactly, I think, the type of thing you're looking for as an admissions officer, is that sort of reflection and perspective that is hard to achieve as a young person. But if you can achieve that in a short essay like this, then that will help you stand out as someone who, as we talked about earlier, is going to have that kind of broad-minded, open-minded perspective about meeting others when they come to college, and is going to be excited about hearing about other people's life experiences, but also thinking about what they can do to help in different ways. And so this particular essay, I think it fits well with the activity list in the way that it tells the story behind the interest that we see at the top of it.
Do you have any ideas that other schools would best fit the student profile?
It's always a tough question to answer because we don't know anything else about the student. And I think one of the things, which I'm glad that you're asking this, because we get this question a lot with InGenius when we're doing public presentations. But I think our sort of school list building process is very involved and very detailed. And I think in so many ways, whether it's size, location, very obvious things, I also think there's an intangible personal approach to the process that students are engaged in with us that allows us to really help us better understand, like, where might they fit? Is it for schools that are known to be more competitive than others, or do they need something that's a little bit more laid back? And I think in a lot of ways, it's hard to look at sort of two pieces of an application, make that list building. I think I will say that for me, this is a broader answer to the question. This student, for me, feels like a very either open type curriculum or a school that really thrives on interdisciplinary options would make the most sense. Because if it's a very rigid sort of curriculum or not very flexible or not able to switch or take classes in different school systems, for example, I don't think the kid would be happy just based upon what we've read so far. So it doesn't give you a real answer, but I think it does help go through the mindset of the conversations we have with our own kids, because we often have them meet a kid one time and then their parents will say, oh, what's the school list? And our response is, that's not what we do right now. We're still trying to get to know them. But I think it does help us navigate qualities that we think a student may like, which then can, in a few next steps, allow us to then jump into other qualities and characteristics that some schools may have that we think may fit them.
I also thought about an open curriculum school looking at this, reading about the wide spectrum of interest, computer science and the law. I think that, again, when you're looking at top U.S. schools, when I'm thinking about fit, I'm less focused on the student's specific major than the issues that interest them or animate them. And so in this student's case, I see an interest, at least in this essay, in criminal justice reform, in helping others who are in difficult circumstances. This student could thrive at any number of schools. This student might be attracted to places where there are very active student groups, for example, who are doing things on criminal justice reform. That could be a compelling reason to choose one school or another, knowing if the schools have very comparable computer science and legal studies and criminal justice programs. A place where the student can combine those academic interests, but also might be willing to, or might be able to find fellow students who are also going to be excited about either this issue or related ones, related social justice or criminal justice issues. And again, be part of a community where students are focused on that, making a change in their community.
And I think that's where research becomes so important, right? Because we know that academically, there are a lot of schools who could suit the students' needs really well. The type of community that is very engaged in this type of activism and advocacy, not every school is going to have a student body that lends itself to even wanting to dive into these issues. So I think it just leads itself even more to school research and the importance of making sure that students understand what is really going to make them happy within their college experience. The major selection is important to consider, but ultimately kids change their minds so often that it can't only be the filter. You have to be navigating what do you really want your day to look like. And for a kid like this, who seems to be so passionate about an area like this, I would be doing exactly what Nick just said, having them do school research and really finding organizations, clubs, professors, city connections, or sort of town connections to policy centers, or something that really allows the student to, no matter what they major in, find opportunities to continue the passion that they are spending so much time doing.
So now that we're recording this episode before regular decisions are released, what advice would you give to your students at InGenius Prep and to all of the students listening right now about handling their college applications, acceptances, rejections, and everything in between as they head into the new year?
One of my former dean at Yale had a phrase that I thought was helpful and always stuck with me. And he would say that almost nothing depends on which college admits you, that is in terms of your life outcomes, but virtually everything depends on what you do when you get to campus. At the end of the day, it's important to keep that big picture in mind. The students that we're working with at InGenius, and I think many ambitious high school students around the country, are going to end up at a school which is going to have an amazing number of resources. And if they work hard, they can achieve anything. And so keep that in mind. If you don't get into your top choice, there are many other great schools out there, and there's going to be a school that's right for you where you can really do anything. And I will say that I went to Yale as an undergraduate. I loved my time at Yale. I thought it was amazing in many ways. But then I did my graduate study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As a graduate student, I also worked as an undergraduate advisor and got to know and taught undergraduates as an instructor as well. So I got to know a bit about life at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I've been amazed at the incredibly unique resources that are available to undergraduates here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There's many things that were not available at Yale for students to explore in different ways. And so every school really has unique resources and opportunities that if students take advantage of them, they can accomplish anything. And so if you don't get into your first choice, whether that's the early decision round or EA round, know that there's going to be many great schools out there. And if you have a well-balanced, thoughtful school list, which we, of course, work with all of our students on very carefully, you're going to have a set of great choices in the spring. Keep in mind that you shouldn't necessarily get into every school that you apply to. If you do that, you're either some amazing once in a million student or you've aimed too low, perhaps. If you apply to 10 schools, I think it's a great goal to get into 4 or 5 or 6 of those and then have some tough decisions to make in the spring when you get your decisions back. But know that there's many great places out there and many great places for you as a student where you can accomplish everything that you'd like to in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think ways this is the most important decision that these students have in their life up to this point. And you want to get into the places you want to get into, obviously, and sometimes it will happen, sometimes it will not. But I love what Nick just said, and I think it's totally true. You have to take advantage of opportunities. And really, no matter where you do that, you're going to thrive and have success when you future endeavors. And I think that's 100% true. At least once a year, I try to check in with former InGenius students that I've worked with over the past 5 to 6 different admissions cycles. And some of them got into the dream school, some of them did not. And it is always interesting to me just the range of experience that students have in either place, either the place that they loved and that they applied ED to and got into, or got rejected from a bunch of places and were choosing between the remaining acceptance options. It's not as though every kid who got into their ED school is, oh my God, this is amazing. And every kid who didn't get into those schools is thinking, this college sucks and I don't want to be here. It's a range of experiences and a range of emotions that in a lot of ways just mirrors life. You have great days and sometimes you have bad days. You have great months. Sometimes you have months that sometimes suck for whatever reason. But college is tough, right? And I think ultimately, no matter where you go to next point, you're going to thrive, you're going to succeed. And I'll just quickly say too, when the bad news comes, because for most kids, it does at some point, it's not ever personal, and it is never a value to who you are as an individual. A rejection, a denial from any school doesn't ever take away from what you've accomplished, and it should not ever make you feel badly about anything that you've done or second guess anything that you've done. I think this is why at InGenius we take a broader approach to this work. Yes, it's about college admissions at the end of the day, but so much more of our time is spent, how are we helping these kids become better people? How are we helping them grow and change? And I know Nick and I have been at the company for a long time where we've worked with individuals on our own for a lot of that time. And I know my favorite part was always seeing the 8th grader or the 9th grader blossom and develop into sometimes a much different person by the time that they graduated from high school. And that to me was always and still is the best part of the job, is just seeing the students' growth and their mindset shift over time. And that is, I think, the biggest win for everyone. And I know that students and families don't often see it that way now, but I think for us, the ability to connect that to college admissions is really the best bridge that we can build, is the ability for kids to become better individuals, better people, and hopefully get into amazing places. But if rejections come, it doesn't take away from that growth and that shift over time. And you're going to find a place within your other acceptances that you're going to thrive in and succeed in and have a wonderful opportunity over 4 or 5 years of college.
I was just going to add briefly, one of the reasons I like this job that I do now is that the skills that we're building with students that we work with, the value of them is not just to get into a top school, but by that, if you are taking seriously the task of exploring your interests, if you're taking seriously school research, and you're reflecting on what you want to get out of your college experience, then that's going to make you a better college student in the future. And so no matter where you end up, if you've really embraced the process that we have at InGenius, and with any kind of college prep counselor like that, then you are going to prepare yourself to thrive wherever you may end up. So that's something you can take with you, no matter what the final result may be.
All right, before we wrap up, I just want to give a huge thank you to the both of you for sharing those amazing insights today. I know our listeners are going to walk away with so much information. This episode was literally packed with information, and honestly, I think we'll definitely need a part 2 because we've got even more Common App profiles to dive into. I apologize for not having the full one ready today, but don't worry, I'll have it all set for the next episode. So to everyone listening, make sure you stay tuned. Part 2 is coming up very soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jillian. Thanks, Nick. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun.
And that is a wrap for today's episode of Inside the Admissions Office. A huge thank you to our guests for their incredible insights and to all of you listening, of course. We hope today's conversation was both helpful and inspiring as you navigate your college journey. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where I'll be bringing Zach and Nick back, and they'll dive even deeper into evaluating the entire Common App profile of real students. So if you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a review or share it with a friend who could use some guidance. So we'll catch you in the next one.